What's up, you guys? Welcome to Walk the Line. I got a special episode lined up for you. I'm going to be giving you my top pound-for-pound GOAT rankings in this video. I also want to preview the huge UFC 309 fight card, and they correlate in a major way because that main event fight between Jon Jones and Stipe Miocic, you want to talk about a legacy fight. You want to talk about pound-for-pound GOATs, right? You're talking about two of the greatest of all time, right? So I'm kind of showing you my cards. I do have Stipe Miocic ranked towards the top of the GOAT list. Of course, we all have Jon Jones there, but when you're talking Stipe Miocic, the greatest heavyweight of all time, right? I mean, if you want to argue with me on that, meet me in the comment section. The only fighter I think that you could really debate with me is maybe Francis Ngannou, but unfortunately, he didn't stick around in the UFC long enough. Him and Miocic are 1-1. Miocic has a longer history of putting work in that heavyweight division. We'll talk more about that, but do I have Jon Jones as the number one pound-for-pound fighter of all time? Stay tuned. I definitely have him towards the top. Give me your guys' top 5. If you want to go there, give me your guys' top 10 pound-for-pound GOAT list. I want to see who you guys have there. And Jon Jones is a huge favorite over Stipe Miocic. It's a little interesting there. We'll preview that in a second. But real quick, before we dive into my list, just want to let you know, if anybody wants to work with me for my official plays for UFC 309, it's going to be a huge card for me. You guys already know that. So reach out to me, whether it's through Instagram, Twitter, or email. Or you go shoot me a message on Instagram and Twitter. Go give me a follow. I got those scrolling below. And the last thing real quick, we are powered by BetUS. A special shout out to my partners, BetUS, who give the best deposit matches in the game. Reach out to me if you're looking to sign up to a new sports book. I will give you my referral link. You're going to get a 150% match on your first 3 deposits. Do not hesitate to reach out to me.
The teller.
At number 5, I got Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson. And just to let you guys know, we'll go 5 down to the number 1 spot, and then we'll peek backwards at fighters that just missed the top 5, essentially previewing the top 10, if you will. But I got Demetrius Johnson at the 5 spot. What an amazing fighter he was. He just recently retired. If you're a newer fight fan and you missed a lot of what he did, not just throughout his MMA career, but what he did in the octagon, I highly recommend you go back and preview his highlight reel. I mean, he was a human highlight reel. You remember the flying armbar that he pulled off on Ray Borg? Even as of recently, the redemption knockout that he landed on Adriano Moraes, that was phenomenal. I mean, you just don't see fighters moving the way that he moved inside the cage. And Joe Rogan used to say that if you were to model your fighting ability off a fighter, Demetrius Johnson is the fighter that you want to emulate. He's just extremely complete. And I think that Joe Rogan really had a point there. One thing that you got to respect about Demetrius Johnson is he was a fighter that put in work in the bantamweight division too. He kicked off his UFC career, in fact, even dating back to the WEC, where I used to watch him fight live back in the day. I used to watch Demetrius Johnson when he was a fighter that was just like 3-0 going into his first ever loss, which was against Brad Pickett. One of the more unfortunate losses of his career. He was just young though. One of the few losses of his career. Just lost 4 times. But I was watching him from way back then. As the UFC brought in the WEC roster, he still fought in the bantamweight division, and he had a lot of success there too. He did take one other loss against Dominic Cruz, but if you guys remember that fight, I remember it vividly watching it live. Dominic Cruz was just much larger in there, and he was able to get away with using his wrestling against the cage, and Demetrius Johnson was still early on in his career. But besides that, he was the inaugural flyweight champion. He went to a draw with Ian McCall the first time. I believe that fight took place in Australia. And then I was there live for the rematch. That fight took place in Fort Lauderdale, where he was able to take out Ian McCall, became that inaugural champion. From there, he went on to defend his title in the UFC. I believe this was a record. Defended that title 11 times in a row. Okay, he went on a crazy winning streak. And I just think that you got to have Demetrius Johnson in the top 5. He's taken out high-level fighters like Joseph Benavidez. We talked about Ian McCall. Maybe some of you aren't so familiar with him, but Ian McCall was really a terror down in the flyweight division. A lot of people had Ian McCall as the real inaugural flyweight champ. Not in the UFC, but even though that first fight he arguably won, but he was a fighter that was the flyweight champ before the UFC ever had that division, overseas. And a lot of people thought that he was the pinnacle of the sport there. That was a big win. Victories over fighters like Henry Cejudo, John Dodson, Kyoji Hiraguchi, there was a big victory there. We mentioned the Ray Borg flying armbar that he landed, and then even having success in the ONE FC. I think you have to have Demetrius Johnson in your top 5. The fighter was just so elite. He's such an elite fighter, and I got DJ at the number 5 spot. And again, what a way to end his career, going out, getting 2 victories in a row against Adriano Moraes, which they were redemption victories because he was brutally knocked out by Adriano the first time they faced off there, and even putting on some entertaining fights to end his career. Had that custom rules fight against Rod Tang. That was fun there too. But I got DJ at the number 5 spot. At the 4 spot, I got Khabib Nurmagomedov. And this may be a little controversial. Let me know if you disagree with me. I'll highlight why I know some people don't really like having Khabib towards the top of this list, while others actually still think he should be number 1. I mean, I guess it really depends how you feel about it. But Khabib, a fighter that was just immaculate in the cage, right? His grappling and his pace, arguably second to none. The issue with Khabib is that he didn't have the long track record when it came to fighting elite fighters. And really, when he came into the UFC, he had an extremely padded record. Right? He came into the UFC I'll pull it up. He came into the UFC around 16-0. And when you take a look at the level of competition of fighters that he was fighting outside of the UFC, it was very low. Okay, so when you compare him to some of these other high-level fighters that cut their teeth fighting the best of the best early on in their career, that's one thing you have to note. Khabib didn't really do that. But once he was in the UFC, it was pure domination. Some people like to bring up that Gleison Tebow fight. I know that one played out a little bit closer than the majority of his fights. But realistically, you can argue that Khabib never lost a round. Okay, now I do feel that he lost a round here and there. I think Conor took that round 1 against him. May have been, who was it? Ali Quinta. Ali Quinta had a couple competitive rounds with him. I don't know if you gave him those rounds or not, but when you're talking about Khabib, you're talking about him just manhandling fighters and just dominating them bell to bell, all right? It's just not a long track record of fighting elite fighters, but you still also have to note that he has his handful of high-level victories, right? When you're talking about victories over Justin Gaethje, as he capped his career off, finishing him in the second round with that triangle choke. I mean, he was just in the prime of his career. What a shame he retired at that moment. Before that, finishing Dustin Poirier, finishing Conor McGregor. Love him or hate him, Conor McGregor is an elite fighter. Take a look at his track record. And had victories over Edson Barbosa, Ali Quinta, Michael Johnson. Take the Michael Johnson one for what you will. I mean, it's a recognizable name, but obviously Michael Johnson, 50-50 fighter at best in the UFC. So not a long list of elite fighters, but you got to have Khabib in your top 5, in my opinion, just based on the fact how dominant he was. And again, what a shame he didn't stay in the UFC through his prime years. I would have loved to have seen him battle some more fighters in that division. There's some fighters that we would have liked to have seen him face that we never got to see. At number 3, I got Anderson the Spider Silva. If you guys weren't around to witness his title reign, it was crazy. Okay, he wasn't just a fighter going out there and sneaking off W's. He was a human highlight reel. He was going out there getting the most phenomenal knockouts. Looked like he was in the Matrix. If you remember that finish that he had against Stephen Bonner, that was crazy. Excuse me, not Bonner. Well, that one too, but the Forrest Griffin knockout was crazy. In fact, that was the only pay-per-view event that I've ever bought, was the Forrest Griffin versus Anderson Silva pay-per-view fight card. That's kind of an interesting fact. The only one that I've ever bought. And that fight was over really quickly, kind of Mike Tyson-esque. You're all amped up for a main event, and it ended quickly and ridiculously. But Anderson Silva, you take a look at the accolades that he has. Okay, he's right behind DJ. He's number 2 as far as having the second most consecutive title defenses in UFC history, with 10 consecutive title defenses. He has the longest title reign in UFC history at 2,457 days. The most finishes in a UFC title fight at 9. The most knockouts in a UFC title fight with 7. The most knockdowns in a UFC title fight at 10. You have to understand, when you were watching him fight in the cage, of course, when it's a title fight, there's just an extra amount of attention to those fights, right? So, I mean, when I'm thinking about Anderson Silva hosting a card, right, being in the main event of a card, the whole town knew about it, man. The whole city knew about it. We're all going to our local bar. Everybody was amped up for it. He always delivered. We always saw something crazy happen. Okay, it wasn't just a lackluster title defense, as we're going to get to a guy here in a minute, which we'll talk about that in a second. But when you were watching Anderson Silva fight, It was phenomenal. It had you talking in the car as you were heading home. Everybody was raving about what happened. You were either very upset with what happened, or you were just, in awe again, backing your boy Silva there. But I mean, a fighter that always rose to the occasion too. You think about how he came back against Chael Sonnen late in that fight. That was a fight that he was down in. He was about to lose his belt there. And I got that submission with just seconds left. That was absurd. If you guys remember the Chael Sonnen fight the first time around. Then he went out there and smashed him in the rematch. But I mean, you take a look at some of the fighters they took out. I mean, there's respectable names there. Maybe it wasn't the highest level of competition, but you got some names to talk about. The front kick that he hit Vitor Belfort with, ridiculous. Vitor Belfort, a very respectable fighter. Yushin Okami, we talked about Chael Sonnen, Damian Maia, Dan Henderson. The Dan Henderson rear naked choke was a big one. Rich Franklin, one of the greatest UFC middleweights of all time. I mean, so he's got a list next to his name as well. Now, the problem with him is that he hung around way too long and he took way too many losses late in his career. But if you guys didn't realize, but I'll also say this, before even he started to string off the losses, he did fall short against Chris Weidman, right? He flat out got knocked out. You can say he was goofing around or whatnot. I mean, he chose to do that, and Chris Weidman cracked him. And I think that Chris Weidman would have got the better of him regardless. But and then in the rematch, he breaks his leg. That was a little unfortunate. But I think that Chris Weidman was just a whole different animal at the time. He was a young fighter that was coming up that had that wrestling base to go along with his boxing skills, and you saw kind of a changing of the guard. At the time of that fight, Anderson Silva was 38 years old. Okay, not a lot of people realize that because he was still so dominant. He was 38 years old. Okay, and after taking those losses, to come back from that leg injury and then fight so many times after. I mean, he fought, a handful of times. Some of these fighters that are younger that are breaking their legs, like Conor McGregor, they're snapping bones in their legs. They're so hesitant to return. It's one of the hardest injuries to come back from. That shows you the warrior spirit that Anderson Silva has. That's another thing that you got to respect, and you got to give him credit there and put him towards the top of your list. When you talk about warrior spirit, Anderson Silva is at the top of the list, and he's still out there messing around, right? Just had a boxing match with Chael Sonnen, had a match with Jake Paul. But if you want to talk about some of the realistic action that he was involved in, his last MMA fight was against Uriah Hall. He was finished up in the 4th round. Think about this. At the time of that fight, Anderson Silva was 45 years old. All right, that's crazy, guys. That's crazy. All right, so you got to tip your hat to Anderson Silva, and you got to have him towards the top of your pound-for-pound rankings. At the number 2 spot, I got my former favorite fighter. Okay, way before Conor McGregor came around, I was a huge GSP fan. I used to go crazy when it was a GSP fight night. I was around all the boys together, headed to the local bar. I was always pumped up to watch the domination that GSP would display in the cage. Just a phenomenal athlete. You take a look at the accolades. He's at number 3 behind Anderson Silva and DJ as far as successful title defenses goes. But the reason why I have GSP ahead of Anderson Silva was for the fact that he only tasted defeat twice. It was very early on in his career, and he got redemption in a major way. Went out there and got finishes in both those losses that he had against Matt Hughes, which he was very young at the time. And Matt Hughes, one of the GOATs of the game. Maybe that's a little bit of a reach, but it was a different era type of fighter. But trust me when I tell you that Matt Hughes was elite, and he was one of the greatest welterweights of all time. Okay, he's in your top 5 list. I know you have to understand the sport was a little different. I'm not saying necessarily you take that Matt Hughes and match him up against today's fighters and that he's going to have a lot of success. But for his era, Matt Hughes was elite, and he was way more primed, and he was able to go out there and get that armbar on GSP. But the way that GSP went out there and finished him up in the 2nd round, hit him with that head kick and got redemption there, you got to put a lot of merit into that. He got caught by Matt Serra, a respectable fighter. He got caught by Serra early on in his career and then just brutalized him in the rematch. I remember watching that fight. Had a great night there when I was just a young buck, but dominating him down in the mat, drilling knees into the midsection as he had him down on the mat, and got redemption in both those fights. And then other than that, he just did not lose rounds. He did not lose fights. And I really respect his resume. Okay, I'm very high on the level of competition that he's went out there and defeated. He took out all the top welterweights. All right, you had some of the best welterweight fighters coming over from other promotions like Nick Diaz. If you guys don't understand how good Nick Diaz was, you guys are slipping, man. Nick Diaz, his boxing was amazing. He had the BJJ skills. GSP handled him with ease. John Fitch, take a look at John Fitch's resume when he was in his prime. John Fitch would have been the welterweight kingpin if it wasn't for GSP. So GSP was just in his way there. There were so many dangerous up-and-comers. You talk about Jake Shields. Jake Shields, a phenomenal grappler, a great fighter. GSP gets the better of him there in that huge event. I think at the time, that was the largest crowd we've ever seen in an event. That fight took place, I believe, in Toronto. I know it was in Canada. I mean, but these are big names, man. Josh Koscheck was a beast. Dan Hardy was a beast. Thiago Alves was a beast. That was the UFC 100 fight card. Alves was this young up-and-coming fighter with nasty Muay Thai. I mean, the list goes on and on, man. Carlos Condit was a beast. Johnny Hendricks on the juice, okay? And that was the one fight that was very competitive. Some people thought maybe GSP lost. I did have GSP winning 3 of the five rounds, but he took a lot of damage earlier on in the fight, but the way he handled things and took over or kind of just controlled that fight, I thought he did enough. And Johnny Hendricks on juice, that guy was a whole different animal. And the way that he also went up and fought in the middleweight division was a 2 weight class champion, getting that victory over one of the greats, and Michael Bisping. I mean, I have GSP at the number 2 spot, man. Just a phenomenal career. Finished 26-2. He was another fighter. It was a little unfortunate we didn't get to see him fight more. He took a lot of years off before returning against Bisping, but he was a fighter that kind of left in his prime to an extent, and maybe it was a smart move. I mean, I think he would have been fine. He would have got a lot more W's. I would have loved to have seen him perform more. And I'll be honest with you guys. Like I said, he was my favorite fighter at the time, and it really rubbed me the wrong way, the way he retired. Same way it did when Khabib retired, and I was very upset about it. I wanted to see him fight more, and imagine just seeing your favorite fighter just dissipate from the fight game when he still had a lot left to offer. But GSP, man, a fighter that moved differently. You got to have him in the top wrestling MMA wrestlers of all time, which is crazy, right? He didn't even have a wrestling background. He had that traditional karate martial art type background, but the way he timed his entries and takedowns and controlled fighters down there, it was so elite. You got to have him in your top 2. I think that his wrestling was that elite, and that's where I have GSP. And then, yes, I do. I have Jon Jones as the number 1 pound-for-pound GOAT of all time. And let me just preface by saying I'm not even really a big-time Jon Jones fan, okay? I admire his work, all right? I used to really not like him. He actually grew on me throughout the years, but it's not like I'm picking Jones as this like huge Jon Jones fan. I'm just being realistic about his resume. When you take a look at the line of work that Jon Jones has put in the octagon, starting off at a very young age, fighting so many legends. He's a fighter that has the most title fight victories in the UFC history at 15. He would have 11 consecutive title defenses if it wasn't for the fact that he was stripped for the belt once upon a time. Jon Jones, he's never lost. And you got to give him so much credit for that, right? We could poke fun. I used to be one of those guys that was poking fun. Oh, yeah, he lost, right? He lost to Matt Hamill. Remember watching that fight back in the day in college, rolling around the carpet, watching him. It was probably on Versus or whatnot against Matt Hamill, and he was destroying him. There was a lot of hype on Jon Jones at the time, at least for us hardcore fans. We knew that he really had big-time potential. Went in there, was out wrestling Matt Hamill. Matt Hamill was a fighter that had a lot of success with his wrestling in the cage, got him down to the mat, was dropping those 12-6 elbows that are now legal, and he got DQ'd for it. You could say, okay, well, he showed to have some low fight IQ and he took an L there, but I mean, let's be real. He was dominating that fight. I mean, he's just never tasted defeat. And you take a look at his line of work. You're talking about victories, right? Since when he grabbed the belt against Mauricio Shogun Rua, that was a fight where he snatched the belt. He was the youngest UFC champion in history. I believe that still holds up, right? The youngest UFC champion of all time. He was just 23 years old. Shogun was just 29. So even though some of us think that like he wasn't in his prime, he really was in his prime. Maybe he wasn't on any performance-enhancing drugs. Maybe he was on some of those in Pride. He looked a little different than some of his vintage Pride days. But Shogun was just 29 years old. That was such a big victory. After that, finishing fighters like Rampage Jackson, who took that fight very seriously, as we just heard him talking about that on the Jackson podcast. I mean, he really took that fight seriously. Submitted Lyoto Machida, victories over Rashad Evans, Vitor Belfort. The Vitor Belfort fight, he almost got caught in that armbar, dug through that. Chael Sonnen, whatever, we'll overlook the Chael Sonnen one. That was kind of a gimmick fight. The Gustafsson fight, 2 victories over Gustafsson. The first one very close, but always in those close fights, he dug deep. He was always clutch. That's the thing you got to like about him. He was always clutch. Victories over fighters like Glover Teixeira, and that was a young, dangerous Teixeira who had such a long line of work fighting outside the UFC. He always had visa issues. He eventually came to the UFC. That was a big victory back then. If you knew what Glover Teixeira was about, victories over at DC multiple times. DC, one of the GOATs in his own right. The victory he just had over Cyril Gane going up to the heavyweight division It was amazing. It was amazing. Now I will argue to you that Cyril Gane is a little bit of a one-dimensional fighter, but the more we're seeing, like we just saw what Francis Ngannou did in his return fight, we're actually seeing that his wrestling is coming around, and maybe his wrestling was better than I gave it credit for, because I was kind of just saying that Cyril Gane is just a one-dimensional fighter that has no grappling skills. Maybe that wasn't completely the case. Maybe the fact that Francis Ngannou took that fifth round at him using his wrestling, maybe it really was due to the fact that Francis Ngannou is a phenomenal fighter and he's coming around there. But I still have question marks there, which will lead us to previewing that Miocic fight here in a second. But that was a huge victory. The only other things I could say is Jon Jones has had a fair share of very competitive fights that you could argue he lost. A lot of people thought that he lost the Dominic Reyes fight, but you really gotta blame Reyes for that, man. Reyes started off so strong and then just took the last 3 rounds off. I mean, that was his fault there. And Jon Jones pressed and looked to take that fight. The Thiago Santos fight, that was a very close fight. I thought Jones did enough to get that one, but it was interesting how Santos kept that fight as competitive as he did with the injury, the torn ligaments in his legs. The OSP fight was a fight that he was coming off a long suspension with the failed drug tests and all that, and that was a fight that played out pretty competitively. And when you take into consideration who OSP is and was, I mean, those are some of the things you can kind of, analyze Jon Jones under the magnifying glass and kind of poke at. But I think when you put it all together, I think Jon Jones is the greatest of all time. And if he gets a victory over Stipe Miocic, the greatest heavyweight of all time, that's just going to put another huge feather in his cap, and it's going to completely solidify that. So let me know, do you agree or do you disagree with me having Jon Jones at that number 1 spot? Now for some honorable mentions, I'm going to say, and these aren't in specific order, but I mean, you're looking at the top 10. These are like the other 5 fighters that I have that just missed the top 5. Stipe Miocic, right in here. If he gets a victory over Jon Jones, I don't know, man. I mean, he may break into the top 5. Now he's taken a couple losses here and there, but I mean, have you guys really dissected what Stipe Miocic has done inside the octagon? Right, one of the only fighters to ever have a victory over Francis Ngannou, and not just the type of victory like Derek Lewis had, where no one threw a significant strike in the fight. I mean, he dominated Francis Ngannou, changing levels, landing big shots on the feet, outboxing him. Yeah, it was a more green Ngannou, but still, that's a major feather in his cap. Going out there, knocking out DC, having 2 victories over DC, right? Getting the better of the trilogy. Those are huge victories. And take a look at his line of work. Victories over Fabricio Verdum, where he took the title. Verdum is a fighter that's towards the top of the greatest heavyweights of all time. Alistair Overeem finished up JDS. We talked about the Ngannou fight. I mean, there's some serious names under his belt. All right. And I just think that Stipe is just a phenomenal fighter. And I don't think that he's really getting the credit he deserves. And I think that there's potential that his fight against Jon Jones can play out competitively and closely, like a lot of Jon Jones fights have gone. Okay. Because Stipe Miocic has way more wrestling ability than Cyril Gane. He can keep that fight standing. And then when you're talking about Jon Jones being in a striking affair, those fights tend to play out closely. Okay. So maybe Jones has success getting takedowns and raining down some ground and pound, but Miocic is pretty fine-tuned there. If Miocic comes in great shape, that's a fight that's going to play out closely, in my opinion. And I think that the betting line is a little crazy. Jon Jones is like almost a minus 700 right now, or give or take. Miocic is a huge underdog, and I think that people are putting a little bit too much stock into that Cyril Gane victory that Jones just had. I think that Cyril Gane is a different fighter than a Miocic, but there's so many question marks. Is Miocic with the ring rust, how is he going to look? Is he going to look anything similar to what we used to see from him? Don't turn the page on Miocic just because he got clipped with a big shot by the knockout artist in Francis Ngannou, who's going to go out there and do that to almost anybody that trades with him there. All right, he got caught. He fought a bad fight. He fought an unintelligent fight in that rematch against Ngannou. I thought he should have been changing levels earlier on and making that fight play out similar to the first one. And obviously, Francis Ngannou developing as a fighter. But I'm very excited for the fight. I think that you shouldn't really be touching Jon Jones with that very high line. I think that line's a little ridiculous, and the value's on the dog there. Just a little sneak peek for you boys that are with me here, okay? And then when we're talking about other GOATs, I do just also want to note Jose Aldo, DC, right? DC with the level of success that he had in the heavyweight division and the light heavyweight division. Jon Jones was just always a little bit of a step ahead of him. Otherwise, he would have been the real, king of the octagon, if you will. Fedor Emelianenko, got to throw him into the mix. Just he never signed with the UFC, never had that continuous proving of himself fighting the most elite fighters. He got away with fighting a lot of lower level fighters over outside of the UFC, over in Strikeforce and whatnot. Don't get me wrong, he fought some high level fighters too, but took his fair share of losses as the level of competition rose up. When you think about like the You know, when he got knocked out by Dan Henderson and just he's been knocked out. I know he was much older, but still he got finished a lot as of recently. Brian Bader knocking him out. I mean, that tarnishes his legacy a little bit there. Who else are we not mentioning? Oh, Islam Makhachev. I think Islam Makhachev is starting to make a case that he's in the top 10 with what he's doing in the cage. He has some big victories over fighters like Alexander Volkanovski, Charles Oliveira, Dustin Poirier, and he's just so dominant. I think you got to throw Islam in the top 10. So that will do it for my GOAT rankings. Please give me some feedback. I want to hear it. A lot of you guys have been going in on me in the comment section, but what you guys don't know is my skin's too tough for that. So I like it. Bring it. You guys can come, poke some fun at my pronunciations. Like I got nothing but time to sit there making sure I sound like a robot with my pronunciations. Listen, guys, I am who I am. I like to just get on the mic and kind of just spit my hot fire. I know these fighters better than anybody. Trust me. I've been watching these fighters fight for just about as long as anybody that's here on the tube or any of you guys tuning in. And I don't mean to sound like cocky when I'm saying that, but don't mistake me just kind of slinging these names out with my accent and whatnot. I just, it's the way I talk, and I don't really like, maybe I should spend more time trying to be one of those, I'll put a little English accent too, and I'll make sure I pronounce these names perfectly. Maybe that's something I need to work on, guys. But I know some of you guys have been just, some of you guys have nothing else to do but just hit the comment section up below, and it makes you feel a little bit better about yourself, about my pronunciations. But I'm super pumped for the UFC 309 fight card. We may be doing that live fight companion. If I do, I hope you guys join me here. And when you're talking about pound for pound GOATs, maybe there's a fighter that's fighting in the main card. Maybe we see his name there in the future. I think he has that type of potential, but we're way far away from that being the case at this moment in time. Bo Nickel, keep an eye on Bo Nickel. Keep an eye on what Ilia Topuria is doing in the octagon. He's a fighter that if he continues that reign over the next 3 to 4 years and just continues to be undefeated, that's a fighter you really got to keep an eye on. Also, hit the comment section below. Who are some fighters that have the potential to break into the top 5 GOAT list over the next 5 years or so? You could even go there, down 5 years. If you want to throw, for some of you wild new age fight fans, you want to throw a Peyton Talbot in the mix. What kind of fighters do you think have that real type of potential to break into the top 5? I want to know. And I'll leave you guys with that. I appreciate you guys greatly. Hit that like button on your way out. Smash that like button right now. Smash it up. Appreciate you guys. Go catch me on my social media. Signing out. Teller.
The teller.